Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Cryption and I hope you are well. Today is officially Christmas Day in the world. Merry Christmas and happy holidays to everybody. I hope you are having a great time. So I figured we would just put out just an early video just to go over some Christmassy stuff which will be epic. So what we're going to look at today is we're going to make it so you can specify some specific dates that you want to celebrate in your game. It could be very random. It could be something akin to the Calendar Man from Batman where you can visit him once a month and get some special goodies or something. It can be anything you want. And today we're going to do some Halloween and some Christmas stuff, and we'll do it based on today's date. So as you're playing, it will do random stuff in the game like spawn something or change functionality. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is basically set up a dev map just so we can test this really easily. And all I'm going to simply do is going to come and copy one of my existing dev maps. And I'll call this m_date changes. And I'll just open this up. Just gives us something faster to jump in and out of, and we'll keep the guard just walking around, why not? So how are we going to go about doing this? Now, as you can imagine, there's a million different ways you can do these things, but what I want to do is create a system where you can go in and easily add things to the level based on the date, and I think that'll be really cool for you maintaining it, so if you ever want to put out an update, you can just add it to this specific place. So what I'm thinking is we're going to use a data table where we put the date in that it needs to celebrate, maybe even a date end. So when it starts and when it ends, if you want to do a between or if you just want to do a specific day, I'm not sure. We'll have a look when we get there. And then I'll put the first thing you're going to want to do is spawn things around the world. So like, say for Christmas, you want to spawn a Christmas tree next to the chair. Whereas for Halloween, we might want to put a mask on the guy, something like that. So for basic spawning, we'll put that in the data table and say spawn this, spawn this, spawn this. But for advanced stuff, so say we want to change his dialogue, or we want to spawn a mask on him if we do want to go down that route, or we want Santa flying across the sky, you know, something like that, then we'll add an option where we can spawn in a almost holiday config blueprint where it can do hard-coded advanced stuff. Now, if you are going to be doing lots of stuff like nearly every holiday you're going to change dialogue, we can build that directly into it. But let's crack straight on. So the first thing I'm going to do is come and create a structure inside my blueprints folder. For those that don't know what a structure is, it is literally just a data storage framework. When you're thinking about the date, you need to think how you want to do it. So do you want Christmas to only be celebrated on Christmas Day, or do you want Christmas to be celebrated for the entire month of December? So it kind of depends how you want it, but I like the functionality of us adding in the ability to do a range, and then you just limit it to one day if you really want to. I think that works quite nicely. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'll do a date start, and I'll come and set the data type to a date time struct. Here, it's another structure. We're using a structure within a structure. I'll add another variable of date end, and that'll still be a date time. The row name, when we use it as a data table, that will be the name of the row, so we don't need to worry about that one for now. So the next thing I'll do is we'll add in a list of spawns, but how are we going to do this? So if I want to spawn a Christmas tree here, presents over here, I could make it one static actor, but if you've got stuff around the entire world you want to spawn, that's not going to be very efficient to have one actor doing all of them. Draw calls wise, sure, yeah. But you're going to be rendering presents 15 miles that way. You don't want that. So we need an array of things to spawn, but then we also need a way to tell them where to spawn. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into my structures again, and I'm going to right click blueprint structure, and I'm going to create another one called s_holiday spawns meshes, and I'm going to open this up. Inside here, I'm going to create another structure that we're going to use that will store the static meshes we want to spawn. So I'll type mesh, and I'll set this to a static mesh. If you, of course, think you're ever going to spawn skeletal meshes, you could equally add in a skeletal mesh here, and I'm going to set this to a type of static to soft class reference, which means it's not going to be loaded in memory every time we try to pull this thing. We will specifically tell it, load this mesh in memory. And then I will also add another variable of transform, and I will set this to a type of transform. And the reason we're using transform is it allows us to specify the location, rotation, and scale if you want to get that advanced. And like I was saying, we'll add it in while we're here. We'll just do a skeletal mesh here as well. So if you want to spawn a skeletal mesh, we can. And we'll set this to a type of skeletal mesh. But it will, again, soft class reference. You could even go as far as spawning a blueprint if you want. I'm not going to go that far because I don't need it at this moment. But you can really add any types you want in there. And then going back to our holiday spawns struct, I'm now going to add in another variable called spawns, and I'll set this to the type of our structure above, so holiday spawns meshes. And just make sure you don't select the same one. Whilst it won't break anything, it'll get a bit weird if you've got within each other over and over on a loop. And then finally, I will just tick this icon at the side and click array here to add an array. Now that we have all this, let's build our data table. So I'm going to come back to my content drawer. Inside blueprints, data tables, I will right click miscellaneous data table, and and then it's going to ask us to pick a row structure. So we'll just pick our structure that we've already created. So s_holiday spawns, and I'll click the top one, click OK, and we'll call it dt_holiday spawns. And then from now on, if you ever need to add a date, you literally just come into this data table, which is really, really cool. So we can add a row at the top. The row here, the row name, I'll just double click it and I'll call it Christmas. And of course you can call this Christmas 2024, 2025 if you ever want to do anything like that. So the date start, it's asking me to provide a start date. So I will come and set this to, let's just do today's date. So 2024, 12/25. And I'll set it to, I'll just put the time as midnight really. We don't really need to do anything about it. There we go. And the end date, I will just set to the same date, but I'll just set it to 26 instead, like so. Now, you might be thinking at first, isn't this going to only work on this year's Christmas? And that is true. So what we're going to do is modify our holiday spawn, and I'm simply just going to add a boolean called ignore year, and just set it to a type of boolean, single. And then I'm going to save it, and I'm going to go over to the default values and set the default to be true. So by default, it's going to tell the start date and end date to ignore the year. So then we can reuse it. But then you've got the option of unticking that if you want a specific year's thing. So say you're celebrating 10 years, you can put a holiday thing in only for that specific year, which will be very nice. The other option, of course, is you add separate variables for date and end. So you have day and month, and then it'll just, you don't need to worry about the time or anything. But I like having the option if I ever need to. Back in our data table, we're ignoring the year because it's going to happen every year. And that's it. So now we can start spawning meshes. So I've got some of these free asset packs from Cinti because they a Santa skeletal mesh, which I will absolutely spawn in somewhere, I think. And then on the Xmas, we have a bunch of different stuff like trees and stuff that have badly messed up. Oh no, they haven't messed up on textures, it's just not loading properly. We'll do a snowman as well. Yeah, so we can just spawn a bunch of random stuff in places, and we could even spawn presents. You can go wild with it, but I'm just going to stay a bit basic for now. So I'll place that Christmas tree there. Let's go back to the details and we'll grab the Christmas tree static mesh. I'll come back up to the data table, I'll add it in and open it up. So I've made a mistake that I make quite often, to be fair. I shouldn't, but I do. For the data type, you may have caught this, and good, and brownie points if you did. We can't use a static mesh class for these here because they aren't classes. Their actual parent is a class of static mesh, but the static mesh has a property of which static mesh it needs. So we can't use the class. Instead, I'm going to come and change this to soft object reference for both of them. If you're on Unreal 5.5 and 5.4, you can just select it there. Otherwise, you'll have to re-find it and then from the little drop down, pick it there. But once you've picked that, now you should see, if I open it up again, we can correctly assign them like so. So I'll place my Christmas tree in. I will come and grab its location, and I'll paste it into here. The rotation and the scale, that's completely fine. I don't want a skeletal mesh at this point, so we're okay. Then I'll add another one in, and I'll just delete them as I go. So for Santa, let's place him. So I'll grab his skeletal mesh actor, paste it at the bottom, grab his location, and paste it there. You very well may want to add additional properties to the skeletal mesh. So you might want to add skeletal mesh animation to play, or animation blueprint. So let's go and do that very quickly. So back on here, I'll add another variable of skeletal mesh animation blueprint. I'll just set this to a anim blueprint, soft object for this one, because again, we need to go and pick the object from the asset browser. So as you can see, we can now add a animation blueprint here for Santa. I don't know what skeleton Santa's got. I'm assuming he's not got my main one. So I'm just going to simply assign his skeleton to one of my other ones and hope it works. So I'll assign it to my night male, except would you like to add the following? Sure, why not? And in theory, I should now be able to give Santa my polygon elven. There you go, yeah. So what I'll do is I'll grab that one and I'll just assign that to his data table. There we go. So now when we create the spawner, we'll be able to spawn all of them. And the final one I'll do is just a little snowman, and the snowman does use rotation this time. Do I want it in there? Yeah, I want it in there. So we'll come back into the data table. We'll add one more row, add the mesh in. Animation blueprint skeletal mesh we don't need to worry about. The location is there and the rotation is 34. Let's do 34. There we go. So now that we've got our data table there and we've got a pretty easy way to break it down, what else do we want to do? So there are different ways we can actually interface with the data table, because all we really need to do is call the data table, find the date and run it. That's it. So we could create it as a blueprint component, but a component is used for assigning to multiple things. You don't tend to create a component to only ever be assigned to one thing. That's just here. Components are typically assigned to multiple things. So if you think of like an inventory, you will assign it to each character and each NPC. If you think of the narrative component, typically you assign that to the player, but you also have the option to assign it to multiple players, hence why it's a component. We don't need to do this on multiple people because we just want it to spawn in the world. So what I'm actually going to do is I think I'm going to add it straight to my player controller. So I'll open this up because the player controller is used across every level because that's what they do. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to add mine to my player controller, because the player controller is always going to be used in the game when you jump between levels. It will rarely change. It might change on the main menu, but we can cater for that if we really needed to some other way. And all I'm going to do is create a new graph for it just to separate it out. So I'll call it holiday event. And then inside here, let's add a function. So add custom event and we'll call it check holiday events. Now, there is something I will say is you could technically call this every second to check as soon as it turns Christmas, bang, then it shows Christmas stuff. That's going to be really inefficient and will tank your performance if you do. If you do want to check it often, I would check every minute or every hour, something like that, every 50 minutes, if you really need to. For my game, I'm just going to check when you load the game up. If the player is playing the game on Christmas Eve all the way through to Christmas, I'm not too worried if it doesn't change it, because I'm just not in the game. They can restart the game, reload the game. When they save or they load or they transport levels, it will check again. That's enough and often enough for me. So in here, check holiday events, what do we want to do? So the first thing we need to do is we want to load that data table. So I'm going to come across and do get data table row names. And the data table we want is going to be our holiday spawns. Then I'm going to loop over this data table. So this is looping over all of the rows within the data table. So Christmas. And then from here, I'm going to drag off of this and do get data table row. And it'll pass in the row name. Then we can set the data table again, like so. And now we're looping over all of the row names in there. And then we're looping over all the values here. So if we break off, you will see we have the dates. Because typically, data tables are more so used when you go directly to a specific row, but you can use them alternatively, like we are. So the first thing we need to do is actually check if the start date and the end date is between what the current date is. And how do we get the current date? It's super simple. You simply type today. That's it. It's built into Unreal. It's fantastic. You'll notice it's blue. That's because it is actually a struct that we can pull off and do break date time, and it will give us all of the specific ones there. So how do we compare today's date with the date start and everything? All we're simply going to do is drag off of this and do more than. And you'll see we get a more than or equal to date time, which is exactly what we want. Then we plug in the date start, and then we can add a branch to it. That's it. So to add the expiring date, what we can do is take the date and do less than equal to, and plug that into the date end, like so. And then all we do is combine them with an and, like so. And that will work. But decryption, you might be saying we need to take into account the year, and that is true. We need to modify the date start and date end year, today's year, if we actually need to. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a new function called update holiday events date time, and I'm going to pass into it a date time. So I'll say current date, and that will be a date time struct. Then I'll set it to modified date, and I'll add another variable called toModifyDate, and that will also be a date time, and it will output a date time called updated date, and I'm going to tick pure. And the reason I'm ticking pure, if you don't know, is if I untick it a moment and go back to our holiday events, when we call this function, we've got to plug it in like so. But if we tick pure, it turns into this nice little node where you don't need to plug an exec pin into it. It's expected data in, data straight out. So how do we modify the year? So I'm going to drag off the toModifyDate and do break to break it apart like so. Then I'm going to make the updated date so we can connect them together. And I'm going to connect to every single one, or at least the ones I care about. So we'll just do them all while we're here. Except the year. That's the only one I'm not going to do. And for the year, if we close these down, I'm going to simply drag off the current date and do get year, and we can plug that in. So now, whenever we call this function, it doesn't matter what year it is in our toModifyDate, it will update it day's year. The month and days you won't really do that on. So we can now use this event here, but I think it'll be a lot nicer if it also takes into account the ignore year. So we call the function regardless, and it has a branch inside it whether or not it actually needs to update it. Super simple to do. All I'm going to do is go back into it. So to make it take into account whether it needs to modify the year, I'm going to break this year off here, just holding the Alt key. And I'm going to drag off of the make year and do a select int. And it will pick one that we need. Then we'll have this node here where we need to place a pick A. So I'm going to drag the pick A into here, and we'll rename it to ignore year. So when it comes in, should it ignore the year? If it's A, then we will simply place in our get year. If it's not, if it's B, because we want it to be a year specific thing, we're placing B like that. And once we neaten it up a little like so, yeah, something along the lines of that. We're not going to see this very often. We can just try our best. But you can see there, it comes in, does it ignore the year? If so, pick A, pass it into here. If not, B, just simply use the simple one and exit it out like that. Whether or not it's more efficient to do a branch and then simply return this year or do the modification, I'm not sure. You're probably talking minuscule amounts if it is at all. But we can come in, because we're not running this often either. Once a day, once a load, it's not massive. But now we can simply come in. We'll just move this across here at the moment. Then we can take the current date, which is our today, and paste it into the current date. The modified date will be the start. Should we ignore the year, we can also tell it to ignore the year, like so. And that will now spit out our updated date, which we can use down here instead of that one. We'll do the exact same thing here, where I'll plug in the current date, the end date, the ignore year, and we can plug that in down here, like so. Then finally, we'll move this back up here, like that. Make sure to try and reuse the same today date as much as you can, because otherwise you'll run into an issue where your dates will be a few seconds out, and that might make the difference for you. For me, it's not going to, but it might do. So now that we've got this all set up here, we can see we've got a output which we can simply add to a branch, and now this should tell us whether or not today is Christmas Day or not. So as a test, let's just see if it's working. So for true, I'm going to put print today is Christmas, and then for false, I will put today is a random ordinary day, and we'll plug it into the false like so. So in theory, if we come and find a way to trigger this, so I'm just going to simply trigger it on event begin play. So after it's spawned all of my UI and I've checked for the door to be spawned into, before all of this, just somewhere nicely, look, I'm just probably going to paste it right here. I will drag in my holiday events event like so. And then we'll make a bit of space for it just so we can wrap it in a comment, just so it's obvious. Holiday events check. Let's make it green and red, or we'll do green for good. Holiday stuff. There we go. Holiday events checker. So as soon as it loads in, it should come into the holiday events and it should check it. So let's have a look. You'll see if we start it now, right at the top it says, today is Christmas. Woo! There we go. So the game knows it's Christmas, and it also knows that I've not deleted the snowman. So now we can actually start looping over and doing the spawning. But this is something we need to be careful of, that I did use the fall for, but I've now got it in my head cracked down. And that is how we handle the spawning. So because all of our data table is full of an array of async loadable actors and meshes, we shouldn't be doing that in a for each loop. So it would be very easy just to go to our holiday checker here, drag off of the spawns, do a for each, and then simply come across and async load everything we need. We can't do that because async loading doesn't work very well in for loops. it advises you all over the internet to not do it in Unreal, which is okay because there's other ways we can do it. So you might think a for each loop is the only way to do it, but it's not. What we can do is create something called a recursive function. Recursive does mean loop, but it also means self-calling. Some people apparently also call it self-executing function, but either way, it's a function that will call itself over and over and over again. What that means is it's not on a loop going do this, do this, do this. It's telling the function to do something, then the function tells it to do something else, such as call itself. And then we've got this function that'll run as long as we need it to. Which sounds a little bit complex, but they're actually super simple and they're so much fun to work with. So what we're actually going to do is once we've found the date that we need here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to promote the spawns to a variable, but it will only be a temporary variable, and I'll call it holiday spawn spawns. Why not? I'll mark it as private because nothing else needs to get to it, and I'll make sure that right at the end, once it's Christmas is true, I will call this right here, like so. We can come and neaten it up a little bit, like so. So there we go, it looks a bit neater now. We don't need to worry about if today is an ordinary day because it just won't do anything like that. Now we've stored all of our spawns here, I'm going to come underneath this function and I'm going to add a custom event called spawn holiday meshes. And the plan with this one is it's going to simply take the first iteration from this list. If it's a valid iteration, so we'll drag off and we'll do is valid index. It means does it actually have something it can call? If it does, then we're going to get it. We'll break it off over here so we can use it. Then we can check the mesh. Is it a valid soft object reference? If it is a valid soft object reference, then it means we have a mesh to spawn. So from this mesh, I can drag off and do async load asset and plug it into the true. Get up there. And remember, you can't do this asynchronous stuff in a function, so you're going to have to deal with a couple of lines, but that's okay. And then, after they're completed, I will do spawn actor from class. The class we want is a static mesh. Actor, there we go. Spawn transform, we have our transform over here, so I'll just put that like that. The default collision handling, you can set this whatever you want. I'm going to tell it to try to adjust the location but spawn itself. And then the only other thing you need to do is off of the return value, do set static mesh like so, and it'll basically tell you to pick a static mesh. Unreal's pretty good at doing that bit for you. Then what we need to do for the mesh is we simply need to resolve this here. So if I drag this down here and do resolve soft reference, I can plug it into there like so. Make sure that you've done your async load asset before you do this resolver, otherwise it'll error. As you can see, when you hover over it, it will return none. That will cause an error. And that's the first bit. So I'm actually going to come in and comment this because it's getting a bit long now. Spawn static meshes. So that's the first part done. So that should loop over and do all of that. The second part is off of this false. If the mesh is invalid, then we want to check if the static mesh is valid. So we'll also do pretty much almost the same thing. So I'm going to copy all of this and paste it down here. But the only place it differs is what properties we use and what actors we spawn. So let's connect that back up to the false like so. So this will be spawning a skeletal mesh. Then if it's false on here, we'll carry on like we need to call the recursive function in a moment. But what we can now do is take this static mesh. I'll just tap R to create a little node and connect it to here. So that'll come in, it will load it. We'll delete the async load and just tell it to reload like that, because otherwise we might get the wrong data type. Sometimes that does happen in Unreal. In here, the static mesh actor will become a skeletal mesh. If you've got a specific NPC you want to spawn, that is where we talked about earlier spawning blueprints and such. We'll connect the transform up to here again, so we'll just drag this down and place it like so. And then instead of this part here, we will come across and do set skeletal mesh asset, like so. Pretty much the same thing, but they're just different functions. And then we will delete this resolver just in case it messes the data type up. We'll just connect it over there and move this down here like so. With a bit of neatening up, you can make it look quite nice actually. So there we go. So there's our two spawnings. So that'll spawn the static mesh and the skeletal mesh. For the skeletal mesh, I haven't actually set the animation blueprint yet. On mine, I'm going to say that you always have to assign a blueprint to it, because otherwise that Santa is just going to be T-posing. But if you want it so it's optional, just do an is valid check like you've done with the branch there. But for me, I'm simply going to drag off the skeletal mesh component and do set anim instance class, like so. Right at the end, I'll plug it into there. It'll ask which class we want. And we, of course, know we want this one over here. So I'll do a couple of R's down here. Then from here, I will drag off and do async load asset just before it assigns it over here. I'm going to tell it to load it. And then once it's loaded it, then we can tell it to resolve the animation blueprint. So we'll neaten it up, and then if we drag off of this and do resolve, it gives us an object. So you can see I've done the same thing I did before. We should have used a class for this one. So I'm going to come back to the holiday spawn meshes, and where I selected anim blueprint, I will click soft class reference, save it, double check that our data type is still okay with us spawning Santa, and then finally we'll take our object and just get the class of that object like so. And we'll expand our comments. So you can see we've nicely done it up neatly. So you can see we've done it semi-nicely. You could argue about semantics, like if we drag down the breakdown here, it might be a bit nicer, but then we have to break it twice. It can go either way. I think it looks alright. The way it is, it's a bit liney, but it does work. It should work how we want it to. And then the final thing we have to do is actually tell it to go to the next actor. So how do we do that? So on this false here, or after this true here, basically after it's finished all its work, then we need to tell it to go back to this and find the next element. So I'm going to come to the end of the static mesh one here, and I will drag in our holiday spawn spawns. Simply tell it to remove the index 0, because that's the one we're currently working on. So this is going to go off and remove it from the array. And then finally, all we do is tell it to recall the event that we're in. So spawn holiday meshes. And that's it. That's your recursive function done. So if you imagine, it will come up here. It will search through all the data table. It will find our Christmas one. It will set the holiday spawns. We will tell it to start spawning the mesh there. It will set the holiday spawns. Back on the for each loop here, once it's completed looping through everything, then it will go to the holiday spawns. It will get the first thing we need to spawn. If there's nothing found, it will just do absolutely nothing. So then end of call, that's it. The recursive function doesn't run. If it does find something, then it will come in. It will spawn the actor for that first item it finds. It will spawn the mesh. It will then set the static mesh. It will then remove the item it's just spawned and then go back to spawn holiday meshes, which will come back over here and repeat the cycle. Does it find one? Yes, because we've got 3. Do this again. Does it find one? Yep. Come back again. It's not found another one. So then it will simply go to false and not do anything. And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. So the only other thing we need to do is just copy this chunk of code, and we need to put it at the end of here. But chunks of code like that isn't fantastic. So I'm going to cut this. So I'm going to come down here and do another event called add custom event, remove top holiday spawn. I'll paste it into here and then plug it into there. We'll add a comment, remove the first holiday spawnable, then call recursive function. So now we've easily got one node we can just add wherever we need it. Remove top holiday spawn, and we'll drag the comment just to encapsulate it, and we'll do the same thing on the skeletal mesh, and we'll drag the spawn to encapsulate it like so. And there we go. So let's try it, ladies and gentlemen, because in theory, we've got everything we need now. So if I go back to my game, we should see the items appear there. And we shouldn't get a performance impact because we're asyncly loading them all. So if I run it now, you will notice it doesn't work. So we do have a Santa, which kind of works, but we don't have any static meshes. Now this is just a quirk of Unreal's static mesh lighting system, but if I press F8, you can see, if we scroll down, we can actually see the static mesh actors. They are there, but they're not spawning. And the reason is, if it's the mobility is marked as static, this doesn't just prevent you from them moving, it does also prevent you changing anything that will affect lighting or navigation. So because we're spawning this in real time, all we're going to do is, before we set the static mesh here, I'm just going to drag off a little bit to give us a bit of room. And then from the static mesh component, I'm just going to do set mobility, and we'll plug it in, and we'll set the mobility to be movable. And we'll click compile and save. Let's try it again now, and you will see the tree and the snowman do spawn, and they should have appropriate collisions like so. How cool is that, ladies and gentlemen? Now it's feeling really, really Christmassy. So the only thing we need to fix now is the fact that Santa is still T-posing. So if we press F8 and click on Santa, we can see that he has been assigned an anim blueprint, but he's not been assigned the specific one. So let's go and take a look back at our code again. So the issue here is that the class of the variable we've assigned in our data spawn here, so the class of Santa's polygon elven, in my case, is an anim blueprint. It's not the actual object we need. So this is something that we have to do a bit funkily in Unreal, by the looks of it. Instead of using an anim blueprint, what we're actually going to use is an object, a generic object, and we'll set it to a soft class reference like so. Back in our data table, you will see we should be able to assign the polygon elven, like so. And then now, instead of getting the class like that, so if we come and drag down this new class version of it, so async load class asset, we can plug it in, and then now we should be able to simply resolve the class into it. Why we can't use the animation blueprint and we have to use an object, I'm not 100% sure. Call it a quirk of Unreal. But now, as we play it, you will see Santa is posed and the meshes are spawned in successfully. And just to make sure that the recursive function isn't being called over and over and over again, we'll just add a print statement at the beginning called hello, and if we run it this time, you will see it says hello 4 times because it checks for the snowman, checks for Santa, checks for the tree, checks if it needs to run again, and then it ends. There we go, ladies and gentlemen. Recursive holiday spawning function. How cool is that? Now, I did promise at the beginning we were going to look at if we wanted to do more complicated things. So how would we do it? So what I'm actually going to quickly do is just come back to my blueprints folder, and inside MISC, I will right click blueprint class. I will create a new folder called holiday spawns. And if you've watched any of my tutorials before, you know this pattern quite well. I'm going to create a blueprint class, actor. I'll call it BPA holiday spawn. And I'll open this up. I'll come to class settings and mark it as abstract. All that simply means is we can't drag it out like so. Inside here, I'll just leave event begin play. And I'll click compile and save. And then back on our S holiday spawns, I will add a variable called holiday spawn BP. And instead of a boolean, I will set it to our BPA holiday spawn, and I will set it to a soft class reference. And one thing I've just noticed, it's going to be far better if we don't add it here. I'm going to delete this variable off of the holiday spawns, and instead I'm going to add it to the spawn meshes, because then we can spawn multiple of them if we really want to. So we'll call it holiday spawn BP. We'll set the type again to BPA holiday spawn soft class reference. Every time we want to spawn something special, we can select the blueprint from in here. So how do we do one? So let's make one really basic that's just going to simply change the weather. If it's Christmas, it makes it snow. You could do this so much easier other ways, but that's what we're going to do. So I'll add a child class called holiday spawn underscore UDS. We'll just call it Christmas, actually. And I'll open this up. So what do I want it to do on begin play when it loads? So we'll make sure we always call the parent, because in case we want anything generic to run. Then let's just simply get ultra dynamic sky. So I'll get all actors of class, ultra dynamic weather. I will get the first version of it. And now that we've got the get part here, all we need to do is call change weather using type. There we go. We can connect it up. We'll set it to now transition to new settings. We'll say 5 seconds. Why not? And we'll just keep the rest like that. The only optimization we will do is simply come off of here and call destroy as well. And I'll hit compile and save. So now if we go back to our data table, we'll just reset it in the spawner. We'll add it to the bottom. Holiday spawn Christmas. There we go. Now back on our player controller, we will refresh this break it down. And then finally, underneath all of this, we'll just copy the chunk of this code again, paste it below. We won't be doing this very often where we do it, it's just when things are vastly different. This one will be spawn BP for blueprint. On the false, we will tell it to come down to the branch just like we've done, checking if it's a valid soft class reference, like so, and we'll plug that into the branch instead. Then we don't need any of this over here, so we can delete all of that. All we need is this remove holiday spawn, which is the trigger to go to the next recursive part. We can clear a lot of these lines actually. The only one we need is the class. Even the transform we don't need, we can just break that and ignore it. But the class we want to spawn is going to be this one here. So we'll make a point, async load it, and then finally plug it into the class like so. I know I've gone over that part a little bit quick, but we've just done all of it and there's nothing different between it. That's it. And there we go, ladies and gentlemen. That should be it. So just going over it again. We start at the very top when we call check holiday events. We loop over our data table. We find the one which matches our date. And if it does, we then call holiday spawns. Then after it finishes, it comes to spawn holiday meshes, where it comes down here and it will loop over it, checking each one. Is it a static mesh? If it is, spawn it and then go back to the beginning. If it's a skeletal mesh, spawn it and go back to the beginning. If it's a spawn blueprint, spawn it and go back to the beginning. All asynchronously loaded, all very, very optimized, very nicely. The lines are a bit messy. You can look at tidying that up in your own way if you want, but quite a few of them use it. You could potentially just keep re-getting it, but for something I'm not going to check often, it's not immensely untidy either. It's just a bit crazy unless you follow it, but it's all commented nicely. That's what comments are for. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we should now click play and it should start snowing. We should see Santa, a tree, and presents. There it is, and then the snow forms up like this. Once the shaders compile, we now have snow. Imagine putting more lighting in, sounds, adding a blueprint for Santa. You could do anything you want. How cool is that, ladies and gentlemen? We now have Christmas in the game, and you can add as many holiday events as you want. It's that simple. If you need to fake the date that you are using it, say you want to test it in preparation, simply come to your player controller, and right at the top where you use the today node, simply just break off of where you're checking it and do make, and just put your date in. So for example, if I wanted to set it to Halloween, I'll set the date, I'll set the month, and I'll set the day, like so. And then if I was to snap my fingers and add Halloween stuff in, we now have a Halloween-based one. And since we've faked the date, if we come in and we click play, we should see everything turn Halloweeny. So, ladies and gentlemen, you can see he has got some cool guy glasses on. It is raining and the pumpkins are out. How cool is this, ladies and gentlemen? We now can set all sorts of things we want super easily. So you can see if I start on my big map with more NPCs, it is currently thinking it is Halloween. If we start it, you will see everything will spawn in. There we go, ladies and gentlemen. Random masks. Everyone's wearing costumes. He has refused to. It's raining. And there we go, ladies and gentlemen. How cool is that? And so there's so much more you can do to this. This is, of course, a basic implementation because I'm going to go off and enjoy Christmas playing with all my new gifts and wishing my family and all my friends happy holidays. If you are going to do mass landscape changes, it might be better instead of having individual spawns to have a data layer. You can simply toggle on or off. Easy enough, simply come to the spawn meshes, add a data layer. That's it. Or even go to your holiday spawns and add a data layer. Go to your player controller and tell it to modify itself how it needs to. It's all encapsulated in this function here, which is recursive, so that async loading works. It's really cool. Of course, if you also want different levels to change, add a level property into it if you really need to. Add another struct that stores the level and the spawns for it. There's so much you can do to it. If you do end up adding it to your game, let me know in comments. Join the Discord if you want and tell all and show off your creation. It'll be really cool to see. Thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. I hope everything goes well. Any issues, let me know down below. I'm going to go enjoy my holidays. I now have a 2-week break from work, which is going to be very nice. I hope you all have a wonderful break. Thank you for tuning in for 2024. It's been a fantastic year, and we're only ever going to keep growing. Thank you for watching. My name is Cryption, and I will see you next time.